maybe you can help me out with this one. There's a movie that I saw, say, in the last 10 years. It's kind of a business crime thriller, like white-collar crime thriller kind of movie, maybe. And I'm picturing a startup company that's real shady and maybe hustles people. Maybe it has to do with scamming stuff on the stock market, something like this. And they rent out this whole floor and business is booming. And it's a bunch of young guys, alpha male types, all getting crazy rich, exploiting the people that they're doing business with. And the point of view character gets into this world and he doesn't feel great about it. And at some point he calls in the authorities or the feds or a contact he has with the police, uses all of his credibility to be like, you got to come here and you got to come armed and you got to bust this thing. He risks everything to make this big play because he believes he can demonstrate to them that the threat is real. But then whenever the authorities get there, the whole floor has been cleared out overnight and all that's left is a bunch of phone cords plugged into nothing and dents in the carpet where cubicles and desks used to be. And of course, the main character, the protagonist, the point of view character, looks like an idiot who cried wolf, and it does tremendous damage to his reputation in the course of the film. I don't know what movie this is. Is that Wolf of Wall Street? Is it something like Wolf of Wall Street? I picture this happening in something not as good as Wolf of Wall Street. This trick you into crying wolf or appearing to have cried wolf to destroy your credibility technique is exactly in Nehemiah 6. What we see Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, the enemies of the returning exiled Jews who were rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem under the leadership of Nehemiah. These guys, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, they're trying to use that exact trick against Nehemiah to get him to violate protocol because there's a terrible threat and I have to do something truly exceptional that isn't right, it isn't normal, but just this one time I've got to do it. But then no threat comes and he ends up looking really, really stupid. And to pull this off, these ethnic outsiders to the returning exiles, they employ an ethnic insider, a guy named Shemaiah, to try to trick Nehemiah into doing this. But Nehemiah is far too clever. But I told you yesterday when we were breaking down this passage in Nehemiah 6 verses 10 through 14 that there's another layer to this. It isn't just the basic trick to say, oh, Nehemiah, you're in big trouble. You should go violate all of the religious, ethnic, cultural norms and hide inside the temple where you're really not allowed to go. You should just go in there and hide out and then you're going to look stupid and be a laughingstock. I think it's more than that. I think that Shemaiah is a very sophisticated insider who, like Nehemiah, is very familiar with the narrative of what we call the Old Testament, the narrative of God's redemptive plan and the story of the people. And Nehemiah has done a masterful job of positioning himself within that narrative. He knows who he is. He knows where he fits. He doesn't step beyond it. He also doesn't duck his role. He seems to have it completely pegged. But the Shemaiah guy, I think, was trying to trick Nehemiah into violating the normal rules of the protocol surrounding the temple so that Nehemiah could be accused of taking great, almost unprecedented liberties with this sacred space for no reason, and so that Nehemiah would be exposed to accusations of imagining himself to be the second coming of the great King David, the greatest king in the history of the Jewish people. Or perhaps so that Nehemiah could be exposed to accusations of imagining himself to be the promised descendant of the great King David, the one who's promised to reign on David's throne forever, a new and greater David, the Messiah. I think that's the game plan here for Nehemiah. If you can't kill him from the outside, you find a way to turn his own people against him by making it look like Nehemiah, who's made it very clear there in the end of chapter 5, that he's not trying to prop himself up, that he's not trying to enrich himself, that he's giving away the things he's entitled to. You take that narrative and you try to flip it to make it look like this guy has designs on setting himself up as a rebellious king, on setting himself up as being the Messiah. And if the Samaritans and the Arabs in the neighborhood can't come together and find a way to kill him because his plan is too good, and if you can't rile up the Persian bureaucracy to get him killed as a rebel against the king, maybe we can rile up the Jewish people and get him killed because he's a false prophet or because they imagine him to be a false claimant to the throne of David. Here's what I think Shemaiah is trying to tap into, and it's really a fairly simple story. We go back in the Old Testament to the time of David, which means we got to go before the Kingses, and we got to go before 2 Samuel, back to 1 Samuel. The David King stuff is in 2 Samuel. The David becoming a guy who could become king is in 1 Samuel. I do not know exactly what chapter this is in, but there's a reason that I am looking and stalling in real time. Chapter 22. No. Chapter 21. Here it is. David protected by Ahimelech. This is the reference. The reason that you got to waste that time with me and hear me turning pages is because it's just meant to be a reminder that not me and not anybody who thinks about the Bible or works on this stuff knows all of these things off the top of our heads. We either have to dig around like you just heard, or we have to Google it or look it up, because it's a very big book and you are perfectly capable with all of the things that you're good at in life. You're great at interpreting. You're great at reading people. You practice this all the time. Normal people can read the Bible and understand it, even if none of us know exactly where every single thing in the whole thing is. Eventually, you can kind of fill in the gaps. You can at least get close. In this case, we found it. The story in reference is 1 Samuel 21. David is on the run from King Saul. Saul used to like him. Saul doesn't like him anymore. He's throwing spears at him. He wants him dead. But David has become the Lord's anointed. This is the guy who God has in mind to take the redemptive story forward, to lead his chosen people. Obviously, that's going to make the sitting king real mad. So David's on the run. It's a real low point for him, and he's having trouble right now with basic things like even getting food to eat for him and his small party of men. This is what happened. 1 Samuel 21:1. David went to Nob. I guess that's the name of the location. I don't know how else you would possibly pronounce it. I don't like it either. We're just going to go with that. David went to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" David answered Ahimelech the priest, "The king charged me with a certain matter, and he said to me, 'No one is to know anything about your mission and your instructions. As for my men, I've told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find.' But the priest answered David, 'I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there's some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women.' David replied, 'Indeed, women have been kept from us as usual whenever I set out. The men's things are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today?' So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away." Okay, look, we don't need to know all the details or get into all the reasons here, but the bread is holy. It's a part of the priestly rituals. It's set apart. It means something. It isn't just normal bread, but these aren't normal circumstances either. And Ahimelech and David both make the calculation that God's judgment will not be upon them for using this bread to sustain David and his men, who were doing the thing that they were supposed to be doing. And just in case you're like, well, I don't know, are we sure that he was right there? The text is ambiguous. In Matthew, right at the beginning of Matthew 12, Jesus affirms, he references right back to that story and affirms when the religious leaders of the day are yelling at Jesus' disciples for not following all the Sabbath rules the right way. Jesus goes right to that story to be like, nah, Ahimelech was right to give him the bread and David was right to eat it. But here's how this ties in with Nehemiah. You see, David was in crisis. Ahimelech knew it, and so they violated the normal rules of protocol. They did something that so violated the norms. It's the equivalent of calling in the SWAT team to go raid a floor of a business building, like in whatever that movie was. And now back here in Nehemiah chapter 6, Shemaiah is suggesting to Nehemiah that he commit a violation like this as well, because it's exceptional times. People are coming at night to try to kill you. We got to break the normal rules. We got to hide in here. This is what we got to do. And Nehemiah could easily have hearkened back to this story from, where did we say it was? 1 Samuel, whatever it was, 20 or 21, to say, hey, I mean, exceptional circumstances. David did the same thing, right? So I'm going to hide out in here until things get better. But Nehemiah apparently doesn't think that this rises to the same level of crisis as David's situation does, and so he won't do it. I absolutely think, especially given that in verse 14 of Nehemiah 6, there are prophets involved in this plan who Nehemiah condemns verbally, I absolutely think that this plan was meant to in some way point a finger back at Nehemiah and say, who does he think he is? He holds himself out as the new David. He holds himself out as maybe the chosen descendant of David. Do we really think he's that guy? Is this dude a little bit full of himself? Should we maybe consider a change in leadership around here? And we know that this kind of tactic could work with people from this part of the world in roughly this era of time, because that's part of the tactic that was used on Jesus, and he did get executed on a cross at the end of all of that affair. Now, I think there is a super fascinating undercurrent to this thing, and Nehemiah doesn't flesh it all out. We don't get to see how it all played out because he sniffed it out so early on that it didn't work its way out to fruition, and we didn't get to see the back and forth and what all of the accusations would be. Clearly, the trick here was to try to get Nehemiah to do something that was in response to a perceived threat. Then the threat doesn't materialize, and he looks like a fool for taking exceptional measures in the face of a threat that doesn't actually exist. He cries wolf and looks stupid. But there had to be a follow-up plan for how the bad guys were going to cash this in and turn Nehemiah's people against him. And I think my theory is as good as any other theory as to exactly what their game plan might have been here. But Nehemiah doesn't fall for it. One, because as I've said a jillion times, he's incredibly shrewd. But two, he doesn't fall for it because his superpower would seem to be that he is crystal clear on the whole story and where he fits into it, what he is and what he isn't. He knows his role, he knows his lane, and he is confidently staying right in that lane. It's kind of wild to see a dude whose superpower, or one of his superpowers, is simply that he knows the story and he knows where he fits in it. All right, that was fun. Moving forward into the next stuff next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.